There exists in the annals of human history a rare breed of individual whose very name seems to carry the weight of destiny itself. These are the figures who emerge not merely to participate in their era but to fundamentally alter its course, to bend the arc of civilization to their will through sheer force of personality, vision, and ambition. Among this exceptional company, one name stands alone in the magnitude of what was achieved in so brief a span of time. In just 13 years, from the moment he assumed the throne of Macedonia at the tender age of 20 until his mysterious death at 32 in the palace of Babylon, Alexander III of Macedon conquered an empire unprecedented in scale, stretching from the sun-baked shores of Greece to the mysterious lands beyond the Indus River. He shattered the greatest power the ancient world had ever known, the Persian Empire, in 3 decisive battles that would be studied by military commanders for millennia to come. He marched his armies across deserts that had swallowed whole civilizations, over mountain passes that scraped the very roof of the world, and into territories where no Western army had ever ventured. What drives a man to such extraordinary heights? What combination of circumstance, education, ambition, and perhaps something indefinable propels one individual to achievements that seem to transcend the normal bounds of human capability? The story of Alexander is not simply one of conquest and battle, though there are battles aplenty and conquests beyond measure. It is a story of transformation, of a young prince educated by the greatest philosopher of his age who would go on to merge the civilizations of East and West in ways that echo down through the centuries. It is a story of loyalty pushed to its breaking point, of soldiers who followed their king to the ends of the earth and then refused to go further. It is a story of cultural fusion and violent collision, of cities founded and civilizations transformed, of the delicate line between genius and madness, between ambition and hubris. Before we embark on this journey through one of history's most remarkable lives, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and click the notification bell so you never miss our explorations of the past. If you find value in these historical narratives, please consider supporting this work with a like. Your engagement helps these stories reach others who share our fascination with the sweep of human history and the individuals who shaped its course. Now, let us travel back more than 2,300 years, to a world where the Mediterranean basin was divided among countless city-states and kingdoms, where the massive Persian Empire dominated the known world from Egypt to the borders of India, and where a kingdom on the northern fringes of Greece was about to produce a figure who would unite these worlds in conquest and leave a legacy that would define an entire age of human civilization. The city of Pella in the Kingdom of Macedonia was not, in the year 356 before the Common Era, considered among the great centers of Greek civilization. The Macedonians occupied a curious position in the Greek world, recognized as speaking a dialect of Greek and worshipping the Greek gods, yet viewed by the sophisticated citizens of Athens, Thebes, and Sparta as rough and semi-barbarous, more akin to the tribal peoples of the north than to the cultured Greeks of the south. The Macedonian nobility drank their wine unwatered, which to proper Greeks was the very mark of a barbarian. They hunted boar with spears and valued martial prowess above the refined arts of poetry and philosophy. Yet it was in this northern kingdom, on either the 20th or 21st of July in that fateful year, that the infant who would become Alexander the Great drew his first breath. His father was Philip II, a man whose own achievements were so overshadowed by those of his son that history has often failed to give him his due. Philip had inherited a kingdom in disarray, beset by enemies on all sides, its army a disorganized rabble, its treasury empty. Through a combination of military innovation, political cunning, and sheer determination, he had transformed Macedonia into the dominant power in Greece. He created a professional standing army, introduced revolutionary new tactics and weapons, and through a mixture of diplomacy and force had brought most of the Greek city-states under his control through the League of Corinth. The army that would carry Alexander across Asia was fundamentally the creation of Philip, a fact that the young Alexander would have done well to acknowledge more often than he did. Alexander's mother was Olympias, a princess of Epirus who claimed descent from Achilles through her mother's line. This claim of heroic ancestry was more than mere vanity. In the Greek world, the line between the historical and the mythological was deliberately blurred, and great families traced their lineages back to the heroes of the Trojan War and even to the gods themselves. Olympias was a woman of fierce pride and equally fierce temper, devoted to mystical religious cults and convinced of her son's divine destiny. The relationship between Philip and Olympias was tempestuous at best. Philip took multiple wives, as was the Macedonian custom, a practice that Olympias bitterly resented. The court at Pella was a place of intrigue and faction, where the children of different wives competed for favor and the succession was never entirely secure. And this atmosphere of ambition and uncertainty, young Alexander grew to manhood. From his earliest years, the boy showed signs of the remarkable qualities that would define his life. The ancient sources, though they must be read with appropriate skepticism given their tendency toward hagiography, nonetheless paint a consistent picture of a child who was both exceptional and difficult. He was intensely competitive, driven by a need to excel that went far beyond normal boyish rivalry. When he heard of his father's victories, he was said to have expressed anxiety that Philip would leave nothing great for him to accomplish. He cared nothing for mere pleasure or indulgence. Where other boys of his age and station might have been interested in the luxuries available to a prince, Alexander focused with single-minded intensity on honor, on glory, on achievement. The most famous story from Alexander's childhood is that of Bucephalus, the horse that would carry him across Asia and into legend. When Alexander was around 13 years of age, a horse dealer brought to Philip's court a magnificent black stallion, demanding the enormous sum of 13 talents. The horse was wild and unmanageable, rearing and bucking at anyone who attempted to mount him. Philip was on the point of having the animal led away when Alexander, who had been watching intently, spoke up. He wagered that he could tame the horse, and if he failed, he would pay the price himself from his own allowance. Philip, perhaps amused by his son's boldness, agreed. Alexander had noticed something that the experienced horseman had missed. The stallion was afraid of his own shadow. The boy turned the horse to face the sun, so that the shadow fell behind him, and spoke soothingly while stroking his neck. Then, in one fluid motion, he vaulted onto the horse's back. Bucephalus, now calm, allowed himself to be ridden. Philip, watching his son gallop back in triumph, is said to have wept and declared that Alexander would need to find a kingdom worthy of his abilities, for Macedonia would be too small to contain him. Whether this story is precisely true in all its details or has been embellished in the telling matters less than what it reveals about Alexander's character. He was observant, noticing what others had missed. He was bold, willing to stake his reputation on his judgment. He was empathetic, understanding the horse's fear rather than simply trying to dominate through force. And he was supremely confident in his own abilities. These qualities would serve him well in the campaigns to come. Alexander's formal education began in earnest when he was 13 years old. Philip, recognizing that his heir would need more than just military training, sought out the finest tutor available in the Greek world. He settled upon Aristotle, the philosopher who had studied under Plato in Athens and who was already recognized as one of the great minds of his generation. To secure Aristotle's services, Philip offered substantial inducements. He rebuilt the philosopher's hometown of Stagira, which he had destroyed during one of his campaigns, and repopulated with its former citizens whom he had sold into slavery. For Aristotle, the opportunity to shape the mind of a future king was perhaps inducement enough. The school was established at Mysa, away from the distractions of the court, in a place known as the precinct of the nymphs. There, in the shade of the groves and beside the flowing streams, Aristotle taught Alexander and a select group of companions who would later become his generals and administrators. The curriculum was broad and deep. They studied ethics and politics, rhetoric and logic, poetry and drama, mathematics and the natural sciences. Aristotle's approach was empirical and observational, encouraging his students to examine the world around them and draw conclusions from evidence rather than relying solely on received wisdom. Alexander developed under Aristotle's tutelage a particular love for Homer's Iliad. The epic poem, with its tales of godlike heroes striving for immortal glory, spoke directly to something deep within the young prince's soul. He identified himself particularly with Achilles, his ancestor through Olympias, the greatest of the Greek warriors who had chosen a short life of glory over a long life of obscurity. Throughout his campaigns, Alexander would carry with him an annotated copy of the Iliad, a gift from Aristotle, which he kept under his pillow alongside his dagger. The heroes of Homer were not simply literary figures to Alexander but models to be emulated, standards against which to measure his own achievements. Yet Aristotle's influence went beyond the classroom. The philosopher instilled in Alexander a curiosity about the world that would manifest itself throughout his conquests. When Alexander marched across Asia, he took with him scientists and scholars whose task was to study and record everything they encountered, from strange plants and animals to the customs of foreign peoples. The information they gathered enriched Greek knowledge of geography, natural history, and ethnography. In Alexander's vision of himself as not merely a conqueror but as a civilizer, spreading Greek culture to the barbarians, we can hear echoes of Aristotle's teachings. But there was a darker side to this influence as well. Aristotle held views about non-Greeks that were common among educated Greeks of his time. He believed in the natural superiority of Greeks over barbarians and advocated that Alexander should rule the Greeks as a leader but treat the barbarians as a despot treats subjects or a master treats slaves. This council would create tension as Alexander's views evolved through his contact with Persian culture and his attempt to create a unified Greco-Persian empire. The student would ultimately diverge from the teacher, and the two men who had once been close would become estranged in Alexander's later years. Alexander's education under Aristotle ended when he was 16. His father recalled him to Pella and appointed him regent of Macedonia while Philip campaigned in Thrace. This was an enormous responsibility for a teenager, but Alexander proved equal to it. When a tribe called the Mede rebelled on Macedonia's northern frontier, Alexander led an army against them, defeated them in battle, drove them from their lands, and founded a city on the site of their settlement, naming it Alexandropolis. This was the first of many cities that would bear his name. 2 years later, at the age of 18, Alexander received his first taste of major battle. At Kyrenia in Boeotia, Philip's Macedonian army faced a coalition of Greek city-states led by Athens and Thebes, the last significant resistance to Macedonian domination of Greece. Philip placed his young son in command of the companion cavalry on the left wing of the Macedonian line. Across from them stood the Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite unit of 300 soldiers who had never been defeated in battle. They were pairs of lovers, bound together by ties of affection and honor, each man fighting to protect his partner and to prove his courage before his beloved's eyes. Alexander led the companion cavalry in a charge that shattered the sacred band. When the battle was over, all 300 lay dead upon the field, having refused to retreat or surrender. Philip wept at the sight of them, recognizing the courage of warriors who had chosen death with honor over life with shame. For Alexander, it was a formative experience, a demonstration that courage alone was not enough against superior tactics and leadership. But the relationship between father and son was not without its tensions. Philip's multiple marriages and the complex politics of the Macedonian court created an atmosphere of uncertainty about the succession. When Philip married a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra, the uncle of the bride made a toast at the wedding feast, expressing the hope that the marriage would produce a legitimate heir to the throne. The implication was clear and insulting, that Alexander, born of the Epirot Olympias, was somehow not fully Macedonian and therefore not a suitable heir. Alexander, in a rage, hurled his cup at the man and demanded to know whether he was being called a bastard. Philip, drunk, drew his sword and lurched toward his son, only to trip and fall. Alexander, looking down at his father sprawled on the floor, said bitterly that here was a man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, yet could not even cross from one couch to another. Mother and son left the court and went into exile. The breach was eventually healed through the mediation of a family friend, and Alexander returned to Pella. But the incident reveals the complexity of their relationship. Alexander loved his father and learned from him, but he also competed with him, measuring himself against Philip's achievements and determined to surpass them. When Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding in the summer of 336, supposedly by a disgruntled bodyguard named Pausanias, rumors swirled that Olympias or even Alexander himself might have been involved. The truth will never be known with certainty. What is known is that Alexander, at the age of 20, suddenly found himself king of Macedonia and commander of its armies, standing on the threshold of the greatest military adventure in history. The assassination of Philip II threw the Macedonian kingdom and the wider Greek world into immediate crisis. A king had fallen at the very moment when he was preparing to lead a pan-Hellenic crusade against the Persian Empire, an enterprise that had been years in the planning. The question that confronted everyone who had a stake in the political order of Greece was simple and urgent. What would happen now? Would the great expedition be abandoned? Would Macedonia's hold over the Greek city-states collapse? Would the kingdom itself descend into civil war as rival claimants fought for the throne? In the courts of Athens and Thebes, in the palaces of the Persian satraps, there must have been those who hoped and expected that the sudden death of the architect of Macedonian power would mean the unraveling of everything he had built. They had reckoned without Alexander. The young king moved with a speed and decisiveness that would become his hallmark. Within hours of his father's death, he had secured the loyalty of the army and the support of key nobles. The murderer, Pausanias, was cut down as he fled, eliminating any possibility that he might reveal who, if anyone, had put him up to the deed. Alexander's potential rivals for the throne met with swift and often fatal accidents. His cousin Amyntas, who had a claim to the throne, was executed on charges of conspiracy. Two of Alexander's own half-brothers shared the same fate. It was brutal, but it was effective. Within days, the succession was secure, and Alexander was the undisputed king of Macedonia. But securing his throne in Pella was only the first step. Philip had spent years bringing the Greek city-states under Macedonian control, but that control was based as much on his personal authority and military prowess as on any formal institutional structure. With Philip dead, many Greeks saw an opportunity to throw off the Macedonian yoke. In Athens, the great orator Demosthenes, who had opposed Philip for years, appeared in public wearing a garland of flowers and declaring a day of celebration for Philip's death. He proposed that honors be voted to Pausanias and that an embassy be sent to Persia to coordinate resistance to Macedonia. In Thebes, there was talk of expelling the Macedonian garrison from the Cadmea, the city's acropolis. Throughout Greece, the death of Philip was seen as a liberation, and many assumed that the young Alexander would be too inexperienced to hold his father's empire together. They were catastrophically wrong. Alexander marched south at the head of his army with a speed that caught everyone off guard. He appeared before Thebes and demanded that the city acknowledge his leadership of the League of Corinth, just as they had acknowledged his father's. The Thebans, confronted with a Macedonian army at their gates, had no choice but to comply. Alexander then proceeded to Corinth, where he convened a meeting of the League. The Greek states, seeing that this young king was no less formidable than his father, voted to recognize Alexander as hegemon, the leader of the League, and to support his planned invasion of Persia. But even as he secured his position in Greece, trouble was brewing on Macedonia's northern frontiers. The Thracian and Illyrian tribes, which Philip had subdued through years of warfare, saw the transition of power as an opportunity to reassert their independence. In the spring of 335, Alexander marched north with his army to deal with these threats. The campaign demonstrated both his military abilities and his willingness to take risks that more cautious commanders would have avoided. When he encountered a Thracian tribe blocking a pass through the Hemus Mountains, they had prepared a trap. They had gathered wagons and carts at the top of the pass, intending to release them to roll down upon the Macedonian phalanx as it advanced up the narrow defile. Alexander, assessing the situation, ordered his men that if they had room to move aside, they should do so and let the wagons pass. If they had no room, they should lie down and lock their shields together over their bodies, allowing the wagons to roll over them. The Macedonians executed this maneuver flawlessly, and few men were lost despite the ingenuity of the enemy's plan. The Thracians, seeing their stratagem fail, broke and fled, and Alexander's army pressed on. The campaign continued through the lands of the Tribalians and across the Danube River, where Alexander encountered peoples who had never before seen a Greek army. At every stage, he defeated those who opposed him and secured the submission of those who wisely chose not to resist. It was a demonstration to the Greek world and to his own soldiers that the son was no less capable than the father had been. But while Alexander was campaigning in the north, a false rumor reached Greece that he had been killed in battle. In Thebes, emboldened by this news, an anti-Macedonian faction seized power and besieged the Macedonian garrison in the Cadmea. They appealed to Athens and other Greek cities to join them in a war of liberation against Macedonia. When word of the Theban revolt reached Alexander, he was hundreds of miles away in Illyria. His response was characteristic. He force-marched his army south, covering the distance in just 14 days, a feat of speed that seemed almost supernatural to those who had not expected him to arrive for weeks. He appeared before the walls of Thebes so quickly that many in the city refused to believe it was really the Macedonian army they saw. Thinking it must be some other force, Alexander initially offered terms. If the Thebans would surrender those responsible for the revolt, he would spare the city. The Thebans, perhaps emboldened by their walls or perhaps simply unwilling to back down, refused. They called out from the battlements that anyone who wished to join with them and the great king of Persia in freeing Greece from tyranny should come over to their side. The insult demanded a response, and Alexander provided one. He gave the order to storm the city. What followed was one of the great tragedies of the Greek world. Thebes, one of the most ancient and honored cities of Greece, the city of the Pamanides and the sacred band, was taken by assault. In the chaos of urban warfare, with Macedonian soldiers and allied Greeks pouring through breached walls and broken gates, the usual rules of civilized warfare broke down completely. The Macedonian soldiers, enraged by Theban resistance and remembering old grievances, killed with abandon. The other Greek contingents in Alexander's army, many of whom had old scores to settle with Thebes from previous wars, showed no mercy. By the time Alexander managed to restore order, 6,000 Thebans had been killed, and 30,000 had been taken prisoner to be sold as slaves. Alexander convened the Council of the League of Corinth and asked them to decide Thebes' fate. The council, dominated by cities that had suffered at Theban hands in the past, voted for the complete destruction of the city. Every building was to be razed to the ground except for the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, who had once written in praise of Alexander's ancestors. The destruction of Thebes sent a message that reverberated throughout the Greek world. This young king would not tolerate rebellion, and those who opposed him would face consequences as terrible as any his father had meted out. But Alexander was shrewd enough to balance this demonstration of power with gestures of clemency toward those who had not joined the revolt. Athens, which had encouraged the Thebans but had not actually sent military aid, was treated with notable lenience. When the Athenians sent an embassy to apologize and plead for mercy, Alexander received them graciously and demanded only that they hand over a few anti-Macedonian demagogues. When his advisors pressed him to insist on this demand, he let it drop, saying that it would be shameful to punish the city that had produced Sophocles and Euripides, Socrates and Plato. The clemency was calculated, demonstrating that Alexander could be merciful to those who submitted and implying what would happen to those who did not. By the autumn of 335, less than 2 years after his father's death, Alexander had secured his northern borders, crushed resistance in Greece, and established his authority beyond any question. He was now ready to turn his attention to the great enterprise that Philip had planned, the invasion of the Persian Empire. In the spring of 334, Alexander prepared to cross the Hellespont with an army of approximately 35,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. It was a formidable force, but it would be pitted against the resources of an empire that stretched from Egypt to the borders of India, that could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and that possessed wealth beyond calculation. Alexander was 22 years old. He was about to embark on a conquest that would change the world. In the spring of 334, Alexander stood on the European shore of the Hellespont, that narrow strait of water that separates Europe from Asia, civilization from barbarism in the Greek imagination. Before him lay the challenge that had defined Greek history for 2 centuries, ever since the armies of Darius I and Xerxes had invaded Greece and been thrown back at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea. The Persian Empire was the colossus that dominated the known world, and Philip had planned this invasion as a pan-Hellenic crusade of revenge for those ancient invasions. Alexander was about to make that vision a reality, though on a scale and with consequences that even Philip had likely never imagined. The army that assembled for the crossing was a magnificent instrument of war, honed by Philip's reforms and innovations and now commanded by a young king who had already demonstrated both his military ability and his willingness to take audacious risks. At its core were the 12,000 Macedonian infantry of the phalanx, the pelsaturoi or foot companions, armed with the sarissa, the 18-foot pike that Philip had introduced. These men fought in a formation 16 ranks deep, the first 5 ranks holding their pikes forward to create a bristling wall of spear points that could push through almost any enemy line. Behind them came the hypaspists, the elite shield-bearing guards, 3,000 strong, who could fight either in the phalanx formation or in more open order as the tactical situation demanded. To these were added 7,000 allied infantry from the Greek city-states and several thousand mercenaries. But the real striking force of Alexander's army was his cavalry. The companion cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen drawn from the Macedonian nobility, was perhaps the finest heavy cavalry force in the ancient world. These men, equipped with long lances and formed into squadrons, would serve as Alexander's hammer, the mobile shock force that would smash into enemy formations at the decisive moment. Supporting them were 1,800 Thessalian cavalry, renowned as the best horsemen in Greece, and smaller contingents of light cavalry, scouts, and skirmishers from various allied peoples. To all these were added engineers who would prove invaluable in the sieges to come, doctors, surveyors, and scholars who would study and record the lands through which they passed. Alexander's first action upon crossing into Asia was heavy with symbolism. He leapt from his ship onto the shore and hurled his spear into the ground, claiming all of Asia as spear-won territory, a gift from the gods. He then traveled to the site of ancient Troy, where he made sacrifices at what was claimed to be the tomb of Achilles. He ran naked around the tomb as the ancient heroes had done, and laid a wreath upon it, while his closest companion, Hephaestion, laid a similar wreath on the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved friend. The message was clear. Alexander saw himself as continuing the work of the Homeric heroes, and like them he was willing to risk everything in pursuit of immortal glory. But there was no time for prolonged ceremonies. Word had come that the Persian forces in the region, commanded by the local satraps and including a substantial force of Greek mercenaries under Memnon of Rhodes, were gathering to oppose the Macedonian invasion. They had assembled their army on the eastern bank of the Granicus River, a stream that ran swift and deep with spring snowmelt. The Persian commanders had debated strategy. Memnon, the experienced Greek mercenary, had urged a scorched earth policy. He argued that the Persians should retreat, destroying crops and supplies as they went, and allow the Macedonian army to exhaust itself marching through a devastated country with no supplies and no opportunity for plunder. It was sound advice, but the Persian satraps rejected it. They suspected Memnon's motives, being Greek himself, and they were unwilling to see their own territories destroyed. More importantly, Persian pride demanded that they meet the invaders in open battle and defeat them. They would make their stand at the Granicus. When Alexander's army approached the river, his scouts brought word of the Persian disposition. The enemy had drawn up their forces on the far bank, their cavalry in the front line and their infantry, including the formidable Greek mercenaries, behind. It was late in the day when Alexander arrived, and his second-in-command, Parmenion, advised waiting until morning to make the crossing. Parmenion was a veteran of Philip's wars, cautious and experienced, and his advice was sound from a conventional military perspective. Crossing a river in the face of the enemy was always dangerous, and doing so late in the day when failure would mean fighting in darkness seemed to court unnecessary risk. But Alexander rejected the counsel. He declared that it would be shameful, having crossed the Hellespont without difficulty, to be stopped by this little stream. More importantly, he understood something about warfare that transcended purely tactical considerations. The Persians expected him to wait until morning. By attacking immediately, he would catch them psychologically unprepared. Moreover, his men were eager for battle, confident in their abilities and in their young king. To delay might give time for doubt to creep in, for the soldiers to dwell on the difficulty of the task ahead. Better to strike while their blood was hot and their spirits high. Alexander led the attack himself, at the head of the companion cavalry. He did not ask his men to do anything he would not do himself, a principle of leadership that would earn him undying loyalty throughout the campaigns to come. The Macedonians plunged into the river, scrambling across the rocky streambed and up the muddy bank on the far side while the Persian cavalry rained down javelins and arrows. It was a desperate struggle. Alexander, conspicuous in his white-plumed helmet and ornate armor, became the focus of the Persian attack. Two Persian nobles, Rosaces and Spithridates, recognized him and charged. Rosaces struck Alexander's helmet with such force that it split, and only the crest prevented the blade from splitting Alexander's skull. As Rosaces raised his sword for the killing blow, Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's companions, rode up and severed the Persian's arm with a single stroke. At the same moment, Spithridates raised his own sword to strike Alexander from behind, but Clitus killed him as well. The battle hung in the balance for these few terrible moments, and the entire course of history might have been different if Clitus had been seconds slower. But once the initial Persian resistance was broken, the battle turned into a rout. The Persian cavalry, having failed to push the Macedonians back into the river, broke and fled. This left the Greek mercenaries, who had been positioned behind the cavalry, isolated and surrounded. These men were professional soldiers fighting for Persian gold, and they knew that Alexander would view them as traitors to the Hellenic cause. When they asked for quarter, Alexander, in what even his admirers acknowledged was one of his less merciful moments, refused. He ordered his phalanx to attack them, and in the bloody slaughter that followed, 2,000 mercenaries were killed and another 2,000 captured. Alexander would send these prisoners back to Macedonia to work in chains, a message to other Greeks that those who fought for Persia could expect no mercy. The victory at the Granicus, though not a large battle by the standards of what was to come, was decisive in its consequences. The Persian defense of the coastal regions of Asia Minor had been shattered, and many of the Persian nobles who might have organized further resistance had been killed in the fighting. Alexander was now free to advance along the coast of Asia Minor, liberating the Greek cities from Persian rule and denying the Persian fleet its bases. One by one, the cities opened their gates. Some genuinely welcomed him as a liberator, particularly those cities that had democratic factions opposed to the oligarchies that the Persians had supported. Others simply recognized the futility of resistance. But not all cities submitted peacefully. Miletus and Halicarnassus both resisted, and at Halicarnassus, defended by Memnon and a determined garrison, Alexander faced his first major siege. The walls were formidable, and the defenders fought with skill and determination. Alexander brought up siege engines, including battering rams and wheeled siege towers, and ordered his engineers to undermine the walls. The defenders sallied out repeatedly to destroy the siege equipment, and for weeks the outcome remained in doubt. Finally, after fierce fighting, the Macedonians broke through the walls. Memnon and his men retreated to the citadels overlooking the harbor, from which they could still be supplied and reinforced by the Persian fleet. Alexander, recognizing that reducing these positions would be costly and time-consuming, left a force to contain them and marched on. As the campaigning season of 334 drew to a close, Alexander had secured the coast of Asia Minor and established Macedonian control over a substantial portion of what had been Persian territory. But this was only the beginning. The great King Darius III, who had succeeded to the Persian throne only a few years before, had not yet personally entered the field. He had left the defense of his western provinces to his satraps and commanders, confident that the vast resources of his empire would eventually wear down the Macedonian invaders. That confidence was about to be shattered. During the winter of 334 to 333, Alexander continued his advance through the interior of Asia Minor, securing his supply lines and his rear as he prepared for the next phase of the campaign. He visited Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia, where there resided in the palace a famous puzzle. The Gordian knot was a complex binding that held together the yoke and pole of an ancient wagon that had supposedly belonged to the mythical King Gordius. An oracle had proclaimed that whoever could loose the knot would rule all of Asia. Many had tried and failed to untie it. When Alexander was shown the knot, he studied it briefly, then drew his sword and cut through it with a single stroke. Whether he was demonstrating that bold action could accomplish what patient effort could not, or simply that he made his own rules, the message was clear enough. The omen, so the story went, was fulfilled that very night when thunder and lightning confirmed the gods' approval of what Alexander had done. By the autumn of 333, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. Alexander had spent the summer consolidating his control over Asia Minor and was now preparing to move south along the coast of the Levant toward Syria and Egypt. Meanwhile, Darius III had finally decided to take personal command of the Persian resistance to the Macedonian invasion. The great king assembled a massive army at Babylon, drawing on the resources of his vast empire. The exact size of this force has been debated by historians, with ancient sources giving wildly inflated figures of hundreds of thousands or even millions. Modern scholars estimate that Darius probably led somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 men, still substantially larger than Alexander's force. Among them were 30,000 Greek mercenaries, professional soldiers who were among the finest infantry in the world. Darius's plan was to move west through northern Mesopotamia and Syria and to position his army between Alexander and Macedonia, cutting the Macedonian supply lines and forcing Alexander to fight at a disadvantage. But the execution of this plan went awry. Alexander had moved south from Gordium, through the Cilician Gates, that narrow pass through the Taurus Mountains, and had occupied the coastal plain of Cilicia. He had fallen ill at the city of Tarsus, possibly from swimming in the cold waters of the Indus River, and had remained there for some weeks while he recovered. During this time, Darius had moved his army west, intending to block the passes through the Amanus Mountains and force Alexander to fight on ground favorable to the Persians. But through a combination of poor scouting and miscommunication, Darius marched his army through a northern pass while Alexander, now recovered, was moving south through a southern pass. The two armies passed each other without knowing it. When Darius discovered his error, he found himself to the north of Alexander, having successfully cut the Macedonian line of communication but also having placed his massive army on the narrow coastal plain near the town of Issus, where the mountains came down close to the sea. It was terrain that negated his numerical superiority, the exact opposite of what he had intended. When Alexander learned that Darius was now behind him, he could hardly believe his good fortune. The gods, it seemed, had delivered his enemy into his hands. He turned his army around and marched north to meet the Persians. The two armies met on the banks of the Indus River, a small stream that ran across the coastal plain into the sea. Darius, realizing his predicament, had to deploy his forces on a front of perhaps 2.5 miles, constrained by the mountains on one side and the sea on the other. He positioned his Greek mercenaries in the center, facing the Macedonian phalanx. To their right, he placed his Persian infantry, the Cardaces, extending his line toward the foothills. To his left, along the coast, he deployed his cavalry, facing the Thessalian cavalry on Alexander's left wing. Darius himself took position in the center, surrounded by his household cavalry and the best of his infantry, as was traditional for a Persian king. Alexander's deployment was equally conventional at first glance. The phalanx formed the center of his line, the Hypaspes were on their right, and the companion cavalry with Alexander at their head were on the far right wing. The Thessalian cavalry and allied horse held the left wing. But Alexander, studying the Persian dispositions, saw an opportunity. The Persian left, along the coast, was strong in cavalry, but the terrain there was less suited to mounted action than the firmer ground further inland. Meanwhile, Darius had extended his line toward the foothills to prevent being outflanked, but in doing so he had weakened his right. Alexander decided to strike there, at the junction between the Persian cavalry and infantry, with his companion cavalry. The battle began with skirmishing between light troops, and then the phalanx advanced into the shallow stream and up the opposite bank toward the Greek mercenaries in Persian service. The fighting here was fierce and costly. The Greek mercenaries were professionals, and they gave no ground easily. The phalanx took casualties, including many officers, and for a time the outcome was in doubt. Meanwhile, on the Persian left, the Persian cavalry charged across the river and engaged the Thessalians. Here too the fighting was desperate, with both sides giving and taking heavy blows. But on the Macedonian right, Alexander had found his opening. He led the companion cavalry across the river and struck at the junction of the Persian cavalry and infantry. The Persians, caught off guard by the ferocity and precision of the attack, began to give way. Alexander, as always fighting in the front rank, carved a path through the Persian line, aiming for the center where he could see the royal standard of Darius. The sight of the Macedonian cavalry breaking through and charging directly toward him unnerved the great king. He had seen the fate that befell the Persian nobles at the Granicus, and he had no desire to share it. Darius turned his chariot and fled the field. The flight of the great king had an immediate and catastrophic effect on Persian morale. The center and right of the Persian line, seeing their king depart, began to disintegrate. The Macedonian phalanx, relieved of the pressure to their front, began to push forward. The Greek mercenaries, isolated and surrounded, fought on with desperate courage, but they were being cut down where they stood. On the Persian left, the cavalry was still engaged with the Thessalians, but when word reached them that Darius had fled and the battle was lost, they too broke and fled. The battle turned into a pursuit and a slaughter. The Persians lost tens of thousands of men, while Macedonian casualties, though significant, were a fraction of the enemy's. In the chaos of the rout, the Macedonians captured Darius's camp, and with it they secured a prize beyond measure. The Persian royal household had accompanied Darius to the battle, confident of victory, and now they fell into Macedonian hands. Darius's mother, Sisygambes, his wife Statira, his daughters, and his young son were all captured. Also taken was the royal treasury with its vast quantities of gold and silver. Alexander, when he entered the opulent Persian pavilion and saw the golden vessels, the rich furnishings, and the lavish luxury of the great king's traveling court, is said to have remarked to his companions, "This, it seems, is what it means to be a king." But more important than the material wealth was how Alexander chose to treat the royal captives. He visited them in their tent, accompanied by his closest companion, Hephaestion. Sisygambes, seeing the two young men both in Macedonian dress, assumed that Hephaestion, who was taller and more imposing, was the king and prostrated herself before him. When the mistake was pointed out, she was mortified, but Alexander reassured her, saying that Hephaestion was Alexander too, implying that they were as one. He promised that Darius's family would be treated with the respect due to royalty, that they would want for nothing, and that none of them would be harmed or dishonored. In an age when the families of defeated enemies were routinely enslaved or killed, this was an extraordinary gesture. Alexander was signaling that he did not see himself merely as a conqueror but as a legitimate ruler, perhaps even as the rightful successor to Darius himself. Sisygambes was so moved by Alexander's treatment that she transferred her loyalty to him, and when she later learned of Alexander's death, she refused food and died of grief within days. Darius, meanwhile, had fled east across the Euphrates, back toward the heartland of his empire. From there, he sent envoys to Alexander with an offer. He would cede to Alexander all the territory west of the Euphrates, pay an enormous ransom for his family, and ally himself with Alexander against any enemy. It was a generous offer, acknowledging Macedonian control over all of Asia Minor and the Levant. Parmenion, the old general, is said to have advised Alexander to accept, saying that if he were Alexander, he would take the deal. Alexander's response was withering, "So would I, if I were Parmenion." Alexander had no intention of stopping. The victory at Issus had shown that the mighty Persian Empire was not invincible, that its armies could be beaten, its king put to flight. More importantly, it had secured for Alexander control of the entire eastern Mediterranean coast, and with it the ability to neutralize the Persian fleet by capturing all its ports. He marched south along the coast, city after city surrendering at his approach. But two cities resisted, Gaza and Tyre. Tyre was an island fortress, separated from the mainland by half a mile of water. It was one of the greatest cities of Phoenicia, wealthy from maritime trade, and seemingly impregnable. The Tyrians believed that Alexander could not touch them, that without a fleet he would be forced to bypass their city and leave them as an unsubdued stronghold in his rear. They reckoned without Alexander's audacity and his engineer's skill. Alexander ordered the construction of a mole, a causeway of earth and stone, to be built from the mainland to the island. It was an undertaking of staggering ambition, and the Tyrians did everything they could to disrupt the work. They sent ships to harass the workers. They launched fireships against the wooden siege towers that Alexander erected on the mole, and they rained down missiles on the Macedonian engineers. But Alexander was relentless. He gathered ships from the cities that had submitted to him, assembling a fleet that could challenge the Tyrians at sea. He brought up ever more powerful siege engines. The siege dragged on for 7 months, but finally the Macedonians broke through the walls. The assault was savage. The Tyrians had resisted for so long and had inflicted such losses on the besiegers that when the walls were breached, the Macedonian soldiers showed no mercy. 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the sack of the city, and 30,000 more were sold into slavery. It was brutal, but it served Alexander's strategic purpose. No other city on his route south would dare to resist. With the coast secured, Alexander marched into Egypt in the winter of 333 to 333. Egypt had been under Persian rule for 2 centuries, but the Egyptians had no love for their Persian overlords. When Alexander arrived, the Persian satraps surrendered without a fight, and the Egyptians welcomed the young Macedonian as a liberator. Alexander was crowned pharaoh, taking on the titles and the divine status that Egyptian kingship conferred. He traveled to the oracle of Zeus Ammon at the oasis of Siwa, deep in the Libyan desert. What transpired there between the young king and the oracle has been the subject of speculation for 2 millennia. According to some accounts, the oracle hailed him as the son of Zeus Ammon, confirming a divine parentage that Alexander, with his belief in his descent from Achilles and Heracles, was more than willing to accept. Whether Alexander truly believed in his own divinity or simply found the claim politically useful is impossible to say. What is clear is that from this point on, he began to present himself not merely as a conqueror but as someone chosen by the gods, someone whose destiny was to unite East and West under his rule. In Egypt, he founded the city that would bear his name more famously than any other, Alexandria. Situated on the Mediterranean coast at the western edge of the Nile Delta, the city would grow to become one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the ancient world, home to the famous library and the lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But all this lay in the future. For now, Alexander had secured Egypt, added its wealth to his treasury and its soldiers to his army, and was ready to turn east, to confront Darius once more and to settle, once and for all, who would rule the vast territories of the Persian Empire. By the spring of 331, Alexander had spent nearly 2 years consolidating his control over the eastern Mediterranean and Egypt. But the great confrontation, the final reckoning with Darius and the main strength of the Persian Empire, still lay ahead. Darius had used these 2 years to gather another massive army, even larger than the force he had led at Issus. This time he would not make the mistake of fighting on ground that negated his numerical advantage. He assembled his forces on the broad plains of Mesopotamia, east of the Tigris River, near the town of Gaugamela, not far from the ancient city of Nineveh. Here the ground was flat and open, perfect for the deployment of cavalry and for the scythe chariots that Darius had gathered from across his empire. Darius had learned from his previous defeats. He knew that Alexander's army was smaller but more cohesive and better trained, that the Macedonian phalanx was a formidable defensive wall, and that the companion cavalry were a devastating offensive weapon. His strategy was to use his overwhelming numbers to envelop the Macedonian flanks and to disrupt the phalanx with his scythe chariots. He even ordered portions of the battlefield to be leveled and cleared to give his chariots the best possible run at the Macedonian line. Scouts reported all of this to Alexander as he marched east, crossing the Euphrates and then the Tigris unopposed. Darius was waiting, and this time he was not going to flee without a fight. Alexander's army had grown since it had crossed the Hellespont 3 years before. Reinforcements from Macedonia and Greece had replaced casualties, and contingents from the newly conquered territories had swelled his ranks. He now led perhaps 47,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, still far fewer than the force Darius commanded, which modern estimates place at between 50,000 and 120,000. As the two armies came in sight of each other on the plain of Gaugamela, the Macedonians could see the vast expanse of the Persian host, stretching as far as the eye could see. Some of Alexander's commanders urged a night attack, hoping to catch the Persians unprepared, but Alexander refused, saying he would not steal his victory. The night before the battle, Alexander slept soundly while Darius, anxious and unable to rest, kept his army under arms, fearing a night assault that never came. When dawn broke on 1st of October, 331, the two armies deployed for what both sides knew would be a decisive battle. Darius placed himself in the center, as tradition dictated, with his best cavalry and infantry around him and the Greek mercenaries in the front line. On his left wing, he positioned Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, with a large force of excellent cavalry from the eastern provinces. On his right wing, he placed more cavalry and contingents from various subject peoples. In front of his line, he positioned his side chariots and a number of war elephants. Alexander's deployment was more complex and more innovative than anything he had done before. He recognized that the Persians outnumbered him on both wings and would attempt to envelop his flanks. His solution was to arrange his army in a formation that resembled a hollow rectangle. The phalanx formed the front line of the rectangle, with the hypaspists on their right. The companion cavalry, with Alexander at their head, were on the far right of the front line. But behind the phalanx, Alexander placed a second line of infantry, composed of allied and mercenary troops, who could face about and fight to the rear if the Persians succeeded in getting around the flanks. On both the right and left wings, he positioned his cavalry at an oblique angle, refused back from the front line, so that if the Persians tried to outflank him, they would have to extend their line and weaken their center. The battle began with Darius launching his side chariots. These were designed to cause panic and disruption in enemy formations, and they were a terrifying sight, racing across the plain toward the Macedonian line with blades attached to their wheels. But Alexander had prepared his men for this. The light infantry, archers, and javeliners rushed forward and shot down the chariot horses and drivers before they could reach the phalanx. Those chariots that did make it through found that the phalanx opened ranks to let them pass, then closed again behind them. The few chariots that penetrated to the rear of the line were dealt with by the grooms and camp followers. The much-vaunted secret weapon had failed to achieve anything. On the Macedonian right, Alexander began to move his cavalry obliquely to the right, as if intending to get around the Persian left. Bessus, commanding that wing, sent cavalry to intercept him, extending his line further and further to prevent being outflanked. Alexander continued to move right, his cavalry and the right wing of the phalanx moving in perfect coordination, opening a gap between themselves and the center of the Macedonian line. Bessus, committed to preventing Alexander from getting around his flank, failed to notice what was happening in the center. Darius, seeing the gap opening in the Macedonian line, ordered a portion of his center to advance and exploit it. It seemed like an opportunity to split Alexander's army in two, but this was exactly what Alexander had been waiting for. As the Persian cavalry and infantry moved forward into the gap, Alexander suddenly wheeled his companion cavalry to the left and charged, not at the Persian flank, but directly at the gap that the Persians had created in their own line by sending troops to close the gap in Alexander's line. The companions, formed in their characteristic wedge formation, smashed through the weakened Persian center and drove straight toward the position where Darius stood. It was the same tactic that had worked at Issus, but executed with even greater precision and at even greater risk. Alexander was driving deep into the enemy army, leaving his own flanks exposed, gambling that he could reach Darius before the Persian numbers could overwhelm him. The hypaspists and the right wing of the phalanx wheeled to follow the companions, protecting their left flank as they drove into the heart of the Persian army. It was a moment of supreme audacity, and it depended entirely on the coordination and discipline of the Macedonian army. Meanwhile, on the Macedonian left, the situation was desperate. The Persian cavalry had succeeded in enveloping the wing, and the Thessalian cavalry, though fighting with great courage, were being pushed back. The Persian cavalry even broke through and attacked the Macedonian baggage train in the rear. But Parmenion, commanding the left, held his ground, and the second line of infantry that Alexander had positioned for just this contingency faced about and engaged the Persians who had broken through. The battle hung in the balance. At the center, Alexander and his companions were cutting their way toward Darius. The Persian household cavalry and the Greek mercenaries fought desperately to protect their king, and the fighting was ferocious. But the momentum of the Macedonian charge was irresistible, and the wedge of horsemen drove ever closer to where Darius stood in his chariot. For the second time the great king lost his nerve. He saw Alexander coming, saw the slaughter around him, and he turned his chariot and fled the field. The effect on Persian morale was immediate and catastrophic. With their king gone, the Persian center collapsed. The cavalry on both wings, seeing the center disintegrate, also began to withdraw. Alexander wanted to pursue Darius immediately, to capture or kill him and end the war in a single stroke, but he received an urgent message from Parmenion on the left wing, calling for assistance. Reluctantly, Alexander broke off his pursuit and led the companions to relieve the hard-pressed left. By the time he arrived, the Persian cavalry, learning of Darius's flight and the collapse of the center, had already begun to retreat. The battle was over, and it was the most complete victory Alexander had yet achieved. The casualties told the story. The Persians lost tens of thousands of men, perhaps as many as 50,000 killed and captured. Macedonian losses were a few thousand, a heavy price but nothing compared to what they had inflicted. More importantly, the myth of Persian invincibility was shattered beyond repair. The largest army the great king could assemble had been utterly routed by a much smaller force through superior tactics, better training, and the leadership of an exceptional commander. In the aftermath of Gaugamela, the heartland of the Persian Empire lay open to Alexander. The ancient cities of Mesopotamia surrendered without resistance. Babylon, the greatest city of the East, opened its gates and welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. The city's enormous treasury was handed over to the conquerors. From Babylon, Alexander marched to Susa, another of the Achaemenid capitals, which also surrendered peacefully. Here he found even more treasure, some 50,000 talents of gold and silver, an almost unimaginable sum. The wealth of the Persian Empire was now funding Alexander's campaigns, and there seemed to be no limit to what he could achieve. But there was one more city that demanded Alexander's attention: Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the city that Darius I and Xerxes had built to demonstrate the glory and power of the Achaemenid dynasty. It was here that the great kings were crowned, here that tribute from all the subject peoples of the empire was brought and displayed. It was the symbolic heart of Persian power, and Alexander meant to make a statement by taking it. The city was defended by its garrison, but they were no match for Alexander's veterans. Persepolis fell, and Alexander allowed his soldiers to plunder it. 4 days, the Macedonians and Greeks looted the palaces and temples, taking everything of value they could carry. The treasure of Persepolis was so vast that it took 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels to carry it away. But Alexander was not content with plunder. In what remains one of the most controversial acts of his career, he ordered the great palace of Xerxes to be burned. The reasons for this decision have been debated endlessly. Some ancient sources claim it was done during a drunken banquet, that a courtesan named Thais urged Alexander to burn the palace as revenge for the Persian sack of Athens 150 years before, and that Alexander, in his cups, agreed. Others suggest it was a calculated political act, a symbolic demonstration that the Persian Empire had ended and a new order had begun. Perhaps it was both. Alexander could be impulsive, especially when drinking, but he was also capable of using symbolic acts to powerful political effect. The burning of Persepolis signaled to all the peoples of the former empire that the Achaemenid dynasty was finished, that there would be no restoration, and that Alexander was now the master of Asia. But Darius himself was still at large, having fled east toward Bactria with the remnants of his army and the support of the satraps of the eastern provinces. As long as Darius lived, there was a chance he could rally resistance, and Alexander could not truly claim to be the rightful ruler of the Persian Empire. In the summer of 330, Alexander set off in pursuit. It was a grueling march through harsh terrain, and Alexander drove his men hard, covering enormous distances at exhausting speed. Finally, word reached him that Darius had been taken prisoner by Bethis, the satrap of Bactria, and other eastern nobles who blamed Darius for the disasters that had befallen the empire. When Alexander learned this, he pushed even harder, taking only the cavalry and the fastest infantry and leaving the rest of the army to follow. He found Darius near the Caspian gates, abandoned by his captors and left to die from wounds they had inflicted when he refused to mount a horse and ride faster. By the time Alexander reached him, Darius was already dead. Alexander, whether from genuine respect or from a desire to appear magnanimous, covered Darius's body with his own cloak and ordered that he be given a royal funeral, with burial in the royal tombs at Persepolis. He declared Bessus and the other nobles who had betrayed their king to be traitors and vowed to hunt them down and punish them. In Alexander's narrative, he was not conquering Persia but avenging its murdered king and restoring legitimate rule. It was a fiction but a useful one. With Darius dead, Alexander was the undisputed master of the Persian Empire from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. He was 25 years old. He had been campaigning for 6 years, and he had no intention of stopping. The death of Darius in the summer of 330 marked a turning point in Alexander's campaigns. Up to this moment, he could present his war as a pan-Hellenic crusade against the Persian Empire, a war of revenge for the invasions of Greece by Darius I and Xerxes. Now that pretense was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Darius was dead, the great cities of the empire had submitted, and the vast treasuries had been captured. By any reasonable standard, the war was over and won. Alexander could have returned to Macedonia in triumph, the greatest conqueror the world had yet seen, and enjoyed the fruits of his victories. That he did not, that he instead pressed on into the remote and barely known eastern provinces of the empire and beyond, tells us something fundamental about his character and his ambitions. Alexander declared that he would pursue and punish the murderers of Darius, presenting himself as the avenger of the late great king and the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne. This required him to march east into the regions that are now Afghanistan and Central Asia, lands that were only nominally part of the Persian Empire and where the local satraps ruled as near-independent princes. Bessus, who had led the conspiracy against Darius, had retreated to his satrapy of Bactria and declared himself great king, taking the royal name Artaxerxes V. Alexander would have to defeat him and secure the submission of the eastern provinces if his claim to rule the whole of the former Persian Empire was to mean anything. The campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana, which lasted from 330 to 327, were unlike anything Alexander had faced before. There were no great set-piece battles as there had been at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela. Instead, the fighting consisted of sieges of mountain fortresses, ambushes in narrow valleys, and pursuit of guerrilla forces across trackless wastes. The local peoples, fierce and independent, had no intention of submitting to Macedonian rule, and they knew their own country in ways that Alexander's army did not. The fighting was brutal and often went against the Macedonians. At the city of Maracanda, modern Samarkand, a Macedonian garrison was besieged and massacred. Spithermenes, a Sogdian nobleman who had initially supported Alexander but then turned against him, proved to be a cunning and elusive opponent, leading Alexander on exhausting pursuits across the steppes. It was during these campaigns that the strains within Alexander's army and his inner circle began to show. The Macedonians had been campaigning for years far from home, fighting in harsh climates against unfamiliar enemies for goals that were increasingly unclear to them. They had been promised wealth and glory, and they had received both in abundance, but at what cost? How long were they to keep marching east, always farther from Macedonia, into lands stranger and more dangerous? Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian customs and his insistence on being treated as a divine monarch in the Persian fashion rather than as a Macedonian king among his peers created resentment among the nobles who had known him since he was a boy. The first crisis came at Maracanda in 328, during a banquet. Alexander and his companions were drinking heavily, as was their custom. The conversation turned to comparisons between Alexander's achievements and those of his father Philip. Clitus the Black, who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, spoke up in defense of Philip, suggesting that Alexander's victories owed much to the army Philip had created and that some of the credit being lavished on Alexander belonged to his father and to the men who fought for him. It was a reasonable argument, but Alexander, drunk and angry, took it as an insult and a challenge to his authority. The argument escalated, with Clitus accusing Alexander of forsaking Macedonian ways for Persian luxury and of treating his Macedonian companions as slaves while elevating Persians to positions of honor. In a rage, Alexander snatched a spear from a guard and hurled it at Clitus, killing him instantly. The banquet hall fell silent. Alexander's closest friends and commanders had witnessed their king, in a drunken fury, murder the man who had once saved his life. Alexander's remorse was immediate and overwhelming. He wept over Clitus's body, called himself a murderer, and refused food and drink for days. His friends eventually convinced him that he had acted as a god might act, beyond the judgment of mere mortals, and that Clitus had provoked his own death through his insolence. It was an ominous sign of the direction Alexander's thinking was taking and of the dangers of treating him as divine rather than human. The following year brought another conspiracy, this time more serious. Philotas, the son of Parmenion and the commander of the companion cavalry, was accused of knowing about a plot against Alexander's life and failing to report it. Whether Philotas was guilty of actual treason or simply of political naivete in not taking seriously what may have been drunken talk will never be known. But Alexander could not afford to take chances. Philotas was tortured and executed, and messages were sent to Media where Parmenion, the old general who had served Philip and Alexander for decades, was living in semi-retirement. The messengers carried orders that Parmenion was to be killed immediately without trial, lest he seek to avenge his son. It was a cold-blooded political murder, and it showed how far Alexander had moved from the Macedonian tradition of ruling by consent of the nobility. From this point on, there was no question that opposition to Alexander, even potential opposition, would be met with lethal force. Despite these internal tensions, the military campaigns continued with success. Bessus was eventually betrayed by his own followers, captured, and handed over to Alexander, who had him executed for the murder of Darius. Spidermenes continued his guerrilla warfare for another year but was eventually killed by his own men, who sent his head to Alexander in hopes of peace. One by one, the mountain fortresses were reduced. The most famous of these was the Sogdian Rock, supposedly impregnable, where many of the Sogdian nobles had taken refuge with their families. When Alexander demanded its surrender, the defenders laughed and told him he would need soldiers with wings to take the fortress. Alexander offered rich rewards to volunteers who would climb the sheer cliff face at night and appear above the fortress at dawn. 300 men made the climb, and though 30 fell to their deaths, the rest reached the summit. When the defenders saw Macedonian soldiers above them the next morning, they believed that Alexander had indeed found winged warriors, and they surrendered. By 327, the eastern satrapies had been more or less pacified, though it would be years before they were truly secure. Alexander had spent 3 years fighting in some of the harshest terrain in the world, and the constant guerrilla warfare had worn down his army. But he was not done. Beyond the eastern borders of the former Persian Empire lay India, a land of which the Greeks knew almost nothing but which was rumored to be fabulously wealthy and populated by warriors riding elephants into battle. The Indus River Valley had once been part of the Persian Empire under Darius I, and Alexander, claiming to be Darius's successor, asserted that this territory too belonged to him by right. Whether he truly believed this or was simply seeking justification for further conquest is unclear. What is clear is that in the spring of 327, Alexander gathered his army and prepared to cross the Hindu Kush mountains into India. The Indian campaign was Alexander's most ambitious undertaking. The army divided into 2 columns. One, commanded by Hephaestion and Perdiccas, took the main route through the Khyber Pass. The other, under Alexander's personal command, took a northern route through the mountains, fighting its way through hostile tribal territory. The fighting was fierce and the terrain was unforgiving. At one point, Alexander besieged the fortress of Aornos, perched on a mountain top that was said to be so inaccessible that even the hero Heracles had failed to take it. Alexander, never one to shy away from a challenge to his reputation, was determined to succeed where Heracles had supposedly failed. Through a combination of engineering skill, personal bravery, and relentless persistence, he took the fortress, though at considerable cost. When the 2 columns reunited in the Indus Valley, Alexander received the submission of several local rulers, including Taxiolath, the king of Taxila, who allied with Alexander against his rival, King Porus. Porus ruled the land between the Hydaspes River, modern Jhelum, and the Aesis River, and he had no intention of submitting without a fight. He assembled his army on the far bank of the Hydaspes, which was in full flood from the spring monsoon rains, and waited for Alexander to attempt a crossing. What followed was arguably Alexander's most brilliant tactical victory, achieved under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. The Hydaspes was wide, deep, and swift, utterly impossible to ford where Porus had positioned his army. Porus had war elephants, animals the Macedonians had never faced in battle before, and a force that may have numbered 50,000 or more. Alexander had about 40,000 men, and he had to get them across a raging river in the face of an enemy who would surely attack them while they were most vulnerable, struggling through the water or emerging exhausted on the far bank. For weeks, Alexander engaged in an elaborate deception. He moved his cavalry up and down his bank of the river, making feints as if preparing to cross at various points, until Porus stopped responding to every movement and the defenders grew complacent. Then, on a dark night with thunder and torrential rain providing cover, Alexander marched upriver with a substantial force, leaving Craterus behind with the rest of the army to keep Porus' attention fixed on the main camp. At a carefully scouted point 17 miles upstream, Alexander crossed with his cavalry and some of his best infantry. The crossing was difficult even so, with men and horses struggling against the current, but by dawn Alexander had his force on the far bank. When Porus learned of this, he sent a force under his son to drive the Macedonians back into the river, but Alexander defeated and killed Porus' son in a sharp cavalry engagement. Porus now faced a dilemma. Alexander was on his bank with a substantial force, but Craterus and the main army were still on the far bank of the river at the original crossing point. Porus had to decide where to commit his forces. He chose to march against Alexander, leaving a screening force to watch Craterus. When the two armies met on the plain, Porus deployed his elephants in front of his line, hoping their size and ferocity would terrify the Macedonian cavalry and break up the phalanx. It was a sound plan, but Alexander had prepared for it. He refused to engage the elephants directly with his cavalry. Instead, he sent his horse archers to harass the Indian infantry while avoiding the elephants. When the Indian cavalry tried to interfere, Alexander launched his companions in a flanking attack that drove them back. The phalanx, advancing in good order, engaged the elephants. The Macedonian infantry had been trained to avoid the elephants' charge, to step aside and attack the animals from the flanks and rear, targeting the mahouts who controlled them and the elephants' vulnerable spots. It was brutal and dangerous work. Elephants seized men in their trunks and dashed them to the ground, or crushed them under their feet. But the discipline of the phalanx held, and gradually the elephants, wounded and panicked, began to run amok, trampling Indian soldiers as well as Macedonians. As the Indian line began to fragment, Craterus, who had been waiting for his moment, crossed the river with the remainder of the army and struck the Indians from the rear. Caught between two forces, the Indian army collapsed. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Perhaps 12,000 Indians were killed, including Porus's son and many of his best officers. Macedonian losses were around 1,000, but many of them were from the elite units. Porus himself fought until he was wounded and could no longer sit on his elephant, then surrendered. Alexander treated Porus with great respect. When Porus was brought before him, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by his bearing and courage, not only returned Porus's kingdom to him but added territory to it. He founded 2 cities on the battlefield, one named Nicaea in honor of his victory, and another named Bucephala in honor of his beloved horse Bucephalus, who had died during the campaign, possibly from wounds received in the battle or simply from old age after carrying Alexander across Asia for more than a decade. The Battle of the Hydaspes was a masterpiece of tactics and logistics, but it would be Alexander's last great victory. After the battle, he pushed on, crossing the Acesines and the Hydrotes rivers, fighting more battles, founding more cities, always pressing east. But his army was exhausted. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years. They had crossed deserts and mountains, fought in climates from the frozen steppes of Central Asia to the monsoon rains of India. Many of the original veterans from the crossing of the Hellespont were dead or too wounded to continue. Those who remained were bone-weary and wanted nothing more than to go home. When Alexander announced his intention to march still further east, to cross the Ganges and conquer the kingdoms that lay beyond, the army mutinied. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, the modern Bios, the officers came to Alexander and told him plainly that the men would go no farther. His closest companion, Cenas, spoke for all of them when he said that the men longed to see their families again, to enjoy the wealth they had won, to return to Macedonia while they were still alive to do so. Alexander raged and pleaded, but for once, his will was not enough. He retired to his tent for 3 days, hoping the men would change their minds, but they did not. Finally, he emerged and announced that they would turn back. He erected 12 enormous altars on the riverbank to mark the easternmost limit of his march, offerings to the 12 gods of Olympus, and then gave the order to begin the return journey. It must have been a bitter moment for Alexander. He had achieved more than any conqueror in history, had created an empire stretching from Greece to India, yet he was being forced to stop not by any enemy but by the exhaustion and homesickness of his own men. He was 30 years old, and he must have felt that his greatest days were behind him. To understand Alexander's unprecedented success, to grasp how a young man of 22 leading an army of fewer than 40,000 could conquer an empire that stretched 3,000 miles from west to east, we must examine not just his personal qualities but the military instrument he commanded and the innovations in tactics and strategy that made his victories possible. Alexander was undoubtedly a commander of genius, but he was also the beneficiary of his father Philip's military revolution, and he had the wisdom to recognize and build upon what his father had created. The foundation of Alexander's army was the Macedonian phalanx, a formation that Philip had developed by studying the innovations of earlier Greek commanders and then improving upon them in fundamental ways. The traditional Greek hoplite phalanx, which had dominated warfare in Greece for centuries, consisted of heavily armored infantrymen fighting in a compact formation 8 to 12 ranks deep. Each hoplite carried a large round shield and a spear about 8 feet long. The phalanx would advance as a solid mass, and victory typically went to the side that could maintain its cohesion and push through the enemy line. Philip transformed this formation by making two crucial changes. First, he armed his infantry with the sarissa, a pike between 18 and 22 feet in length, far longer than the traditional hoplite spear. This weapon required both hands to wield, which meant that the soldier could not carry the large hoplite shield. Instead, the Macedonian phalangite wore a smaller shield strapped to his left arm. The advantage of the sarissa was reach. A Macedonian phalanx could present a hedge of spear points that reached out beyond anything an enemy could match. The first 5 ranks of the phalanx could all bring their pikes to bear, creating a virtually impenetrable wall of steel. The men in the rear ranks held their pikes upright, providing some protection against missiles and ready to step forward if the men in front fell. The second change was the creation of a professional, full-time army. Previous Greek armies had been militias, citizens who owned their own equipment and who served for brief campaigns during the campaigning season before returning to their farms. Philip made soldiering a year-round occupation, paying his men from the royal treasury. This allowed him to drill them constantly, to create a level of discipline and coordination that militia forces could never match. The Macedonian phalanx trained to execute complex maneuvers, to wheel and change facing, to maintain formation over broken ground, to open gaps to allow cavalry or light troops to pass through and then close again. This required endless practice, and Philip's professional army made that practice possible. But the phalanx, for all its power, was essentially a defensive weapon. It was excellent at holding ground, at pinning an enemy in place, at creating a solid center on which a battle line could anchor. But it was not mobile enough to pursue a broken enemy or to exploit tactical opportunities as they arose. For that, Philip and Alexander relied on their cavalry, and it was here that the Macedonian system truly revolutionized warfare. The companion cavalry, drawn from the Macedonian nobility and the wealthiest citizens, was the first true shock cavalry in European history. These were not lightly armed horsemen who skirmished and harassed. They were heavy cavalry, equipped with long lances and trained to charge home with devastating impact. The companions fought in a wedge formation rather than in a straight line. This gave them several advantages. The wedge could penetrate an enemy line like a spearhead, concentrating maximum force at the point of impact. It also placed the squadron commander at the tip of the wedge, where he could see what was happening and adjust the direction of the charge in real time. Most importantly, it put Alexander himself, who commanded the royal squadron of companions, at the very front of his army in every major battle. He did not lead from a safe distance, issuing orders and watching the battle unfold. He led from the front, fighting in the first rank, sharing every danger with his men. This personal leadership style was central to the loyalty and extraordinary courage that his soldiers displayed. They would follow Alexander anywhere because they knew he would never ask them to go anywhere he would not go himself. The genius of the Macedonian military system lay in the combination of these two very different forces. The tactic that Alexander used in nearly every major battle has come to be called the hammer and anvil. The phalanx would advance and engage the enemy center, pinning them in place like an anvil. Then, at the decisive moment, Alexander would lead the companion cavalry in a charge against a weak point in the enemy line, usually at an oblique angle to the phalanx. The cavalry were the hammer, smashing into the enemy with overwhelming force and breaking through their formation. Once the breakthrough was achieved, the phalanx would push forward, and the entire enemy line would collapse. This sounds simple in description, but the execution required precise timing, perfect coordination between units that were moving at different speeds and in different directions, and the ability to adapt when things did not go as planned. It required a level of training and discipline that no previous army had possessed, and it required a commander who could see the entire battlefield and make split-second decisions in the chaos of combat. Alexander possessed both the trained army and the tactical genius in abundance. But he had more than just tactics. He had a deep understanding of logistics, of the mundane but absolutely essential work of keeping an army fed, equipped, and able to march and fight. Ancient armies traveled on their stomachs, and an army that outran its supply lines would starve long before it could be defeated in battle. Alexander managed his supply lines with great care, usually following coastlines or rivers where possible so that ships could bring supplies forward. When he had to march across difficult terrain, he prepared supply depots in advance or moved fast enough that his army could live off the land without outrunning the available forage and food. He also understood siege warfare, and he had the best military engineers in the world. When he encountered fortified cities that would not surrender, he could bring overwhelming force to bear. His engineers built enormous siege towers that could be rolled up to enemy walls, allowing soldiers to fight on the battlements at the same level as the defenders. They constructed battering rams protected by armored sheds to break down gates and walls. They undermined walls, digging tunnels beneath them and then burning the timber supports so that the walls would collapse. At Tyre, when faced with a city on an island, his engineers built a causeway half a mile long across the open sea, an engineering feat that would have seemed impossible to most commanders. Alexander succeeded in sieges because he was willing to bring to bear whatever resources and ingenuity were required, and because he was patient enough to see them through to the end, even when they took months. Beyond tactics and logistics, Alexander understood the psychological dimension of warfare. He inspired his men not just through personal example but through carefully crafted appeals to their desire for glory and wealth. He reminded them constantly that they were making history, that their deeds would be remembered forever, that they were the conquerors of the world. After victories, he held elaborate funeral games for the fallen, ensuring that their sacrifice would be honored. He distributed plunder generously and made sure that soldiers who distinguished themselves in battle were rewarded and promoted. When he himself was wounded, which happened often, he made a point of showing himself to the army so that they could see he shared their hardships. He also used terror effectively. The destruction of Thebes, the sack of Tyre, the brutal suppression of rebellions in Bactria and Sogdiana, all these served notice that resistance would be met with overwhelming and merciless force. But he balanced this with calculated clemency toward those who submitted. Cities that opened their gates were treated well, their citizens protected, their properties respected. The message was clear: submit and prosper, resist and face annihilation. This combination of fear and inducement made many of his conquests easier than they might otherwise have been. Finally, Alexander had an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty and devotion in his men. Part of this was his personal bravery and his willingness to share every hardship. He drank the same water, ate the same food, slept on the ground as his soldiers did. There are stories of him refusing water when his army was thirsty, of him marching on foot when his men had to march on foot. But beyond this, there was something in his personality, a charisma that contemporaries recognized even if they could not define it. His men believed in him, believed that he was favored by the gods, that he could not be defeated, that following him would lead to glory and riches beyond imagining. This belief was worth more than any number of tactical innovations. Yet for all his military genius, Alexander was not infallible. His heavy casualties in some battles, particularly Hydaspes and in the sieges of fortified cities, showed that even the finest army could be ground down by determined resistance. His decision to march through the Gedrosian desert on the return from India would prove disastrous. And his increasing reliance on terror and his growing paranoia about conspiracies would eventually alienate even his closest companions. The military machine that Philip had built and Alexander had perfected was formidable, but it was also fragile, dependent on the extraordinary cohesion and morale of its soldiers, and that cohesion was beginning to fray by the time Alexander turned back from India. The return journey from India, which began in the autumn of 326, would prove almost as costly as the conquests themselves. Alexander divided his army into 3 groups. Craterus would lead the bulk of the forces, along with the war elephants and the baggage train, north through Arachosia and back to Persia by the easier northern routes. Nearchus, Alexander's admiral, would take the fleet down the Indus River to the sea and then sail west along the coast, exploring the sea route between India and the Persian Gulf. Alexander himself would march with a smaller force through the coastal regions of Gedrosia, modern Baluchistan, establishing supply depots to support Nearchus's fleet. The plan was sound in theory, but its execution would turn into a nightmare. The march through Gedrosia would become one of the great military disasters of the ancient world, rivaling in losses some of Alexander's bloodiest battles. The region was a waterless desert, far more inhospitable than Alexander had anticipated. The guides he had hired either did not know the country as well as they claimed or deliberately misled him. The army found itself marching through trackless wastes, with no water, no fodder for the animals, and no supplies. Men began to die from thirst and heat. The pack animals collapsed, and the supplies they carried had to be abandoned. Discipline began to break down as men fought over the little water that could be found. Alexander shared every hardship with his men, refusing any special treatment, but his presence could not conjure water from stone or make the desert less lethal. There are accounts of the army marching at night to avoid the worst of the heat and of soldiers digging in the sand of dry riverbeds, hoping to find water. Of the approximately 25,000 soldiers and many thousands more camp followers who entered Gedrosia, perhaps only half emerged alive. It was a catastrophic loss, larger than the casualties from all Alexander's major battles combined. Why did Alexander choose this route? Some historians suggest he was trying to emulate and surpass Cyrus the Great and Queen Semiramis, who were said to have crossed Gedrosia with their armies, though both had suffered terrible losses. Alexander, driven always by his need to equal or exceed the achievements of legendary figures, may have been attempting to prove that he could succeed where they had barely survived. Others suggest it was simply a miscalculation, that he did not realize how difficult the desert crossing would be until it was too late to turn back. Whatever the reason, the Gedrosian campaign was one of Alexander's few clear failures, and it demonstrated that even his genius had limits. When the survivors finally emerged from the desert and reached Carmania, they were met by Craterus and his column, who had taken the northern route and arrived in good order. Shortly afterward, Nearchus appeared with the fleet, having completed his voyage along the coast with minimal losses. There was a joyful reunion, but the disaster in Gedrosia had shaken the army's confidence in their king's judgment. For the first time, Alexander had led his men into disaster not through enemy action but through his own decision. From Carmania, Alexander proceeded to Susa and then to Persepolis, retracing his route through the heart of the empire he had conquered. But what he found disturbed him deeply. Many of the satraps he had left in charge of provinces had behaved as if Alexander would never return, embezzling funds from the treasury, raising private armies, oppressing the local populations. Some had even begun striking their own coins, a prerogative reserved for kings. Alexander ordered a series of purges. Satraps were arrested, tried for corruption or treason, and executed. The message was clear. Alexander was back and he would tolerate no challenge to his authority. At Susa in 324, Alexander staged an extraordinary ceremony. He arranged for a mass wedding in which 92 of his senior officers were married to Persian noblewomen, while he himself married 2 more wives, Statira, the daughter of Darius III, and Persidas, the daughter of the previous king Artaxerxes III. At the same time, he offered rewards to any of his common soldiers who had taken Asian wives, and thousands came forward to register their unions. The weddings were conducted according to Persian custom, with Alexander and his officers reclining on couches while their brides were brought to them, symbolizing the joining of the Macedonian and Persian nobility into a single ruling class. To many of his Macedonian soldiers and officers, this was the final proof that Alexander had gone native, that he had abandoned his Macedonian identity for Persian ways. The tension came to a head at Opis, where Alexander announced that he was discharging the oldest and most wounded veterans, sending them home to Macedonia with lavish bonuses and pensions. He may have intended this as an honor, a recognition of their long service, but the soldiers took it as an insult. They shouted that he could send them all home and complete his conquest with his Persian friends. The confrontation grew ugly, and for a moment, it seemed as if there might be open mutiny. Alexander's response was characteristically bold. He leapt down among the soldiers and seized 13 of the ringleaders, ordering them to be executed immediately. Then he turned on his heel and locked himself in his quarters, refusing to see anyone or to eat. For 2 days the army stood in shocked silence. Finally, a delegation of soldiers came to plead with Alexander, weeping and begging for forgiveness. Alexander emerged and addressed them, reminding them of all they had achieved together, of the bond between them, and he too wept. There was a reconciliation, and Alexander held a great feast at which 10,000 Macedonians and Persians sat together, with Greek and Persian priests making offerings to the gods. But the incident revealed the depth of the division between Alexander's vision of a unified empire and the Macedonians' desire to maintain their privileged position as conquerors. In the months that followed, Alexander's behavior became increasingly erratic and autocratic. When Callisthenes, the court historian who was a relative of Aristotle, refused to perform proskynesis, the Persian custom of prostrating oneself before the king, Alexander had him arrested on suspicion of involvement in a conspiracy among the royal pages. Whether Callisthenes was actually guilty of conspiracy is doubtful, but he died in custody, and Alexander's relationship with his old teacher Aristotle, already strained, was severed entirely. The greatest personal blow came in the autumn of 324 when Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend and possibly his lover, fell ill and died. Alexander was devastated. He ordered elaborate funeral games and commanded that a massive funeral pyre be built at Babylon at enormous expense. He declared a period of mourning throughout the empire and even had Hephaestion's doctor crucified for failing to save his patient. The loss of Hephaestion seems to have unmoored Alexander emotionally. He threw himself into planning new military campaigns, perhaps to distract himself from his grief. By the spring of 323, Alexander was in Babylon, planning an expedition to conquer Arabia. He was also making plans for further campaigns, possibly into the western Mediterranean to subdue Carthage and eventually Italy. Embassies were arriving from all over the known world, from Libya and Ethiopia, from the Greek cities of Italy, possibly even from Rome itself, though this last is disputed. To these embassies, Alexander appeared as the master of the world, receiving their homage as a god-king. But there were evil omens. Chaldean priests warned Alexander not to enter Babylon from the west, saying their god Bel had warned them it would be fatal for him. Alexander initially tried to heed this warning, approaching from the east, but found the route impassable due to marshes and so entered from the west after all. While reviewing his fleet on the Euphrates, a sudden gust of wind blew Alexander's diadem from his head into the water, where it became entangled in reeds near some ancient royal tombs. A sailor swam out to retrieve it and, to keep it dry, placed it on his own head as he swam back. Some saw this as an omen that Alexander would lose his crown and that another would take his place. In early June of 323, Alexander attended a prolonged banquet and drinking party hosted by one of his companions, Medius of Larissa. Alexander drank heavily, as was his custom. Sometime during or after the banquet, he developed a fever. For the first few days, he continued to carry out his duties, making sacrifices and meeting with his officers to finalize plans for the Arabian expedition. But the fever grew worse, and soon he was too weak to leave his bed. For 12 days, he lay in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon as his condition steadily deteriorated. He lost his voice and could not speak, though he remained conscious and could still recognize his officers when they filed past his bed. On the 10th or 11th of June, 323, Alexander died. He was 32 years old. He had reigned for 12 years and 8 months and had conquered an empire larger than any the world had yet seen. What killed him remains a mystery to this day. Ancient sources mention typhoid fever, malaria, poisoning, and excessive drinking as possible causes. Modern medical historians have proposed everything from acute pancreatitis to West Nile virus to Guillain-Barré syndrome. One disturbing modern theory suggests that Alexander may not actually have been dead when he was declared dead, that he was suffering from a condition that left him paralyzed and unable to speak but still conscious, and that his body's supposed resistance to decay for several days was actually because he was still alive. We will never know for certain. What we do know is that Alexander died without clearly naming a successor. According to some accounts, when asked on his deathbed to whom he left his kingdom, he answered, "To the strongest." Whether he actually said this or whether it was invented later to justify the wars that followed, it captured the reality of the situation. Alexander left behind an empire with no clear line of succession, no institutional framework for governing such a vast territory, and a collection of powerful generals and satraps who would soon be at each other's throats fighting for control. Within days of Alexander's death, his generals were arguing over the succession. The army acclaimed Alexander's half-brother, Philip Aridius, as king, though Philip had some form of mental incapacity and was clearly unfit to rule. When Alexander's widow Roxana gave birth to a son a few months later, the child was named Alexander IV and declared co-king with Philip Aridius. But these were figureheads. Real power lay with the generals. For the next 40 years, the wars of the Diadochi, the successors, would rage across the former empire. Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Antigonus, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Craterus, and others would fight for supremacy, and in the process, they would tear apart everything Alexander had built. By the time the dust settled, 3 major kingdoms had emerged from the wreckage: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the Near East and parts of Asia, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia and Greece. Alexander's dream of a unified empire blending East and West died with him. And yet, though Alexander's political empire fragmented, his cultural legacy would prove far more enduring than any political structure could have been. The period from his death in 323 to the final conquest of the last Hellenistic kingdom by Rome in 30 BCE is known as the Hellenistic Age, the era when Greek language, culture, and ideas spread across the Mediterranean world and deep into Asia, creating a cultural synthesis that would shape the development of Western civilization. Alexander had founded more than 20 cities during his campaigns, many of them named Alexandria. The most famous was Alexandria in Egypt, which would grow to become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, home to the famous library with its hundreds of thousands of scrolls, and the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders. But there were Alexandrias scattered across the former empire, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the banks of the Indus River. These cities were settled by Greek and Macedonian veterans, who brought with them Greek language, law, architecture, and customs. They became centers from which Greek culture radiated outward into the surrounding territories. The language that spread was not the classical Greek of Athens but Koine, a simplified, common dialect that developed among Alexander's multi-ethnic army and became the lingua franca of the Hellenistic world. This was the language in which the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, would be written. It was the language of the New Testament, and thus the language in which Christianity would spread across the Roman Empire. The cultural importance of Alexander's conquests in making Greek the common language of such a vast territory cannot be overstated. Greek art and architecture underwent a transformation in the Hellenistic period. Where classical Greek art had emphasized idealized forms, balance, and restraint, Hellenistic art explored emotion, drama, and realism. Sculptors created works like the Laocoon group, showing figures in extreme physical and emotional distress, or the Venus de Milo, combining classical beauty with a new sense of movement and life. Architecture became grander and more elaborate, with massive temples, palaces, and public buildings that combined Greek principles with Persian and Egyptian influences. Philosophy and science flourished in the Hellenistic kingdoms, particularly in Alexandria. The Ptolemies, who ruled Egypt, lavished patronage on scholars and founded the Museum, a research institution where learned men could pursue their studies supported by royal funds. In Alexandria, Euclid systematized geometry in his Elements, a work that would remain the standard textbook for 2,000 years. Archimedes made fundamental discoveries in mathematics, physics, and engineering. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, suggesting that the Earth revolved around the Sun, an idea that would not be accepted until the time of Copernicus nearly 2,000 years later. The Hellenistic kingdoms also facilitated trade on an unprecedented scale. The roads that Alexander's armies had marched along became trade routes. The cities he founded became commercial hubs. Merchants carried goods from India and China along what would later be called the Silk Road to the Mediterranean, and from there to all parts of the Hellenistic world and eventually to Rome. Spices, silk, precious stones, and exotic goods from the East became available in the markets of Alexandria and Antioch. Greek wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods flowed east in return. This trade brought wealth but also cultural exchange. Greek artistic styles influenced Indian art, particularly in the Gandhara region, creating a unique Greco-Buddhist artistic tradition where the Buddha was depicted in the style of Greek statuary. Indian philosophical and religious ideas, including Buddhism, began to spread westward, though they would not have significant impact in the Mediterranean world until much later. The political legacy of Alexander was more complex. None of the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from his empire managed to create a stable, enduring political structure. They were constantly at war with each other, and internal stability was maintained more through the personal authority of the king and the military force at his disposal than through any institutional framework. The idea of the divine right of kings, which Alexander had embraced and which was a Persian tradition, became the standard model for Hellenistic monarchy. The king was not merely a first among equals as Macedonian kings had traditionally been, but a semi-divine figure whose authority was absolute. Yet these kingdoms, for all their instability, preserved and transmitted Greek culture to a degree that would not have been possible otherwise. When Rome began to expand eastward in the 2nd century BCE, conquering first Macedonia, then the Seleucid Empire, and finally Egypt, the Romans encountered a world that was thoroughly Hellenized. And the Romans, impressed by Greek culture even as they conquered Greek kingdoms, adopted much of what they found. Roman art, literature, philosophy, and education were all heavily influenced by Greek models. The Romans conquered Greece militarily, but as the Roman poet Horace would later write, captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror and brought the arts to rustic Latium. Through Rome, the legacy of Alexander and the Hellenistic world was transmitted to medieval Europe and eventually to the modern West. The Greek language and Greek texts were preserved and copied by Byzantine scholars. When the Byzantine Empire finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, Byzantine scholars fled west, bringing with them their manuscripts and their knowledge of Greek, and this influx of classical learning helped to spark the Renaissance. The rediscovery of ancient Greek philosophy, science, and literature, much of it from the Hellenistic period, was instrumental in the development of modern science and the Enlightenment. In military terms, Alexander's influence lasted even longer. His tactics and strategies were studied by every great commander who came after him. Julius Caesar, who fancied himself a new Alexander, consciously modeled his campaigns on Alexander's example. Napoleon carried a copy of Arrian's history of Alexander's campaigns with him and studied it closely. The hammer and anvil tactic, the use of combined arms, the importance of mobile shock forces, the value of speed and surprise, all these principles that Alexander demonstrated so brilliantly have remained fundamental to military thinking right down to the present day. But perhaps Alexander's most profound legacy was the very idea of universal empire, of a single ruler governing diverse peoples and territories, not through naked force alone but through a synthesis of cultures and traditions. It was an idea that would inspire imitators for centuries. The Roman Empire, which at its height stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, was in many ways an attempt to recreate what Alexander had built. The Persian and then the Islamic empires that arose in the East saw themselves as heirs to the Achaemenid tradition that Alexander had interrupted. The idea of universal monarchy would persist through the medieval period, with the Holy Roman Empire claiming to be the continuation of Rome's universal authority, and it would influence European imperialism in the modern era. Yet for all this legacy we must also acknowledge the cost. Alexander's conquests were built on unprecedented bloodshed. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, died in his campaigns, in the battles, in the sieges, in the famines and epidemics that followed in the wake of his armies. Entire cities were destroyed, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. The cultures that were displaced or transformed by Hellenization, the Persian, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Indian civilizations with their ancient traditions, suffered incalculable loss. The synthesis that Alexander created was not a peaceful blending of equals but the result of violent conquest, and we should not romanticize it. Moreover, the political unity that Alexander briefly imposed lasted barely beyond his own lifetime. The wars of the Diadochi were devastating, and they ensured that the Hellenistic world would never know the peace and stability that might have allowed its cultural achievements to flourish even more. The Hellenistic kingdoms were constantly at war, constantly unstable, and this political fragmentation ultimately made them vulnerable to Roman conquest. One can argue that Alexander created more problems than he solved, that his legacy was more one of conflict and instability than of lasting achievement. What, then, are we to make of Alexander the Great? How do we evaluate a life that was so extraordinary, so filled with achievement and also with cruelty, with brilliance and with hubris? There is no simple answer, and perhaps that is appropriate for a figure so complex and so contradictory. On one level, Alexander's achievement was staggering and undeniable. In 13 years, he conquered the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen. He defeated every army that faced him in open battle. He took cities that were thought to be impregnable. He marched his army across terrain that would have defeated lesser commanders, from the burning deserts of Egypt to the frozen mountains of the Hindu Kush. He displayed a level of tactical and strategic genius that has been the subject of study and admiration for more than 2 millennia. His personal bravery was beyond question, and his ability to inspire loyalty in his men was remarkable. But Alexander was also deeply flawed. His increasing paranoia led him to kill men who had served him faithfully, including Parmenion, who had been Philip's most trusted general, and Clitus, who had saved his life. His adoption of Persian customs and his insistence on being treated as a divine monarch alienated many of his Macedonian companions. His refusal to name a clear successor meant that his empire collapsed into civil war within hours of his death. His decision to march through the Gedrosian desert cost more lives than several of his major battles. And his relentless drive to conquer, to always push farther, to never be satisfied with what he had achieved, ultimately destroyed him. If he had stopped after Gaugamela, if he had consolidated his conquests rather than always seeking new ones, he might have lived a long life and left a stable empire. Instead, he drove himself and his army to the breaking point and died young, leaving chaos in his wake. There is also the question of whether Alexander's conquests were ultimately beneficial or harmful. He spread Greek culture across a vast territory, creating the conditions for the Hellenistic synthesis that would influence the development of Western civilization. But he did so through violence and coercion. He destroyed ancient cities and cultures. He enslaved hundreds of thousands. The price of his vision of a unified world was paid in blood, and we should not forget that when we marvel at the grandeur of his achievements. And yet, for all his flaws, for all the destruction he wrought, there is something in Alexander's story that continues to fascinate us more than 2,000 years after his death. Perhaps it is the sheer audacity of what he attempted and achieved. Perhaps it is the glimpse he offers us of what human ambition and courage can accomplish when pushed to their absolute limits. Perhaps it is the tragic dimension of his story, the young man who conquered the world but could not conquer himself, who achieved immortal fame but died alone and young in a foreign land, his dreams unrealized and his empire already falling apart. Alexander wanted to be like Achilles, to win immortal glory even if it meant a short life. In this, at least, he succeeded completely. His name has echoed down through the centuries. His deeds have been celebrated in art and literature, studied by soldiers and statesmen, debated by historians and philosophers. In the purely objective sense of being remembered, of leaving a mark on history that would never be erased, Alexander achieved exactly what he set out to achieve. But was it worth it? That is a question each of us must answer for ourselves. For Alexander himself, there can be no doubt. He would rather have lived 32 years filled with glory and achievement than 80 years in obscurity. He would rather have died young having conquered the world than lived to old age having accomplished nothing worthy of memory. In his own terms, by his own measure, Alexander's life was a triumph. For the rest of us, living in a world he helped to shape, the judgment must be more nuanced. We can admire his genius while acknowledging his cruelty. We can marvel at his achievements while lamenting the cost at which they were purchased. We can study his campaigns as masterpieces of military art while remembering the hundreds of thousands who died in those campaigns. We can appreciate the cultural flowering of the Hellenistic age while recognizing that it was built on conquest and subjugation. In the end, Alexander the Great remains what he has always been. One of the most remarkable, most controversial, and most influential figures in all of human history. His story is a story of ambition without limit, of courage without equal, of success beyond imagining, and of a young man who wanted to conquer the world and very nearly succeeded. It is a story that has captivated humanity for 23 centuries, and it will likely continue to captivate us for centuries to come. If you've enjoyed this deep exploration into the life and legacy of Alexander the Great, please consider subscribing to this channel and sharing this video with others who appreciate the study of history. The past has so much to teach us, and these stories of extraordinary individuals and extraordinary times deserve to be told and retold, examined and debated, so that we might better understand not just where we came from, but who we are and who we might become. Thank you for listening, and may your own journeys, wherever they lead, be filled with the same spirit of courage and curiosity that drove Alexander to the ends of the earth.